Alfredo, recently we marked 100 years after the First World War. Can we compare the situation in politics, economy, ideologies, movements, and so on and so forth in this current, today's Europe with those events which happened some 100 years ago?
We can compare in the sense that we live a moment of great instability and clearly a moment of transition, political transition and economic transition. We live in circumstances in which neoliberalism, the moment, the phase, the mode of existence of capitalism as we see it today, has entered an economic crisis about a decade ago, and a few years later entered into a political crisis that is leading to the rise of authoritarianism across many countries in the West, and then spreading out to other regions in the world. So just like the period at the beginning of the 20th century, this is a moment of instability and a moment of transition. But it is a moment of instability and transition with different characteristics from that one. It's not as if we're going to slide into a world war as the world did 100 years ago. But we have to be able to capture it, to understand, to identify the factors that are generating economic instability and political instability today. And they, in many senses, are different from the factors that were active 100 years ago.
The result of the end of the First World War were, among other things, emerging of fascism, Nazism, communism, and several empires went down and so on and so forth. Today, fascism is again active in Europe. Can we compare this fascism with that fascism 100 years ago or less? Because this fascism today says that they're a kind of not aggressive fascism, that they would like to see itself as legitimate members of the parliamentarian democracy system, that they would like to get into the parliament and so on and so forth. So what would be the comparison between those fascist movements then and these kind of inclinations to various kind of fascistic and extreme right movements today in Europe?
We are in again a moment of transition in that sense as well. After the economic crisis of neoliberalism that started in 2007, a crisis that neoliberal economies and political systems could not resolve, we see the rise of authoritarianism in different parts of the world. But this is an authoritarianism that is different from the fascisms of the 1920s and 30s. The fascism of the 1920s and 30s it emerged in the context of a confrontation between the West and a highly active communist movement centered in the Soviet Union, but with large communist parties and great working class mobilizations around the world, and in Europe in particular. What we have today is not the confrontation between two diametrically opposed economic systems, a confrontation taking place on the streets, through strikes, through paramilitary forces, through a mass politics taking place on the street. No. What we have taking place today is a politics of strong men, it's usually men, exceptionally women, that project upon themselves the capacity to resolve the political impasses of neoliberalism through the recovery of economies on radicalized neoliberal lines. And that, to me, is the fundamental contradiction that we have today. An unresolved economic crisis of neoliberalism that is being addressed through the rise of authoritarian leaders that promise to confront neoliberalism, promise to implement nationalist economic policies, promise to be able to address the failings of finance, the difficulties that globalization of production has brought about, promise to address the crisis of employment around the world through more neoliberalism. This is intrinsically a betrayal of their own voters. And to me, this implies that this rise of authoritarianism today is intrinsically unstable. The fascism that you mentioned, that will come, but it will come in the next step, when this form of politics fails.
Then what is the alternative to the failure of neoliberalism? Is it by definition more authoritarianism and more rightist movements, or there is possibility something else to emerge, let's say, on the left part of the political spectrum?
I think the dominant tendency today, because neoliberalism economically and politically demolished the left over the past 4 decades or so, the dominant tendency is for the rise of right-wing authoritarianism and for the emergence of new forms of fascism. But as the Bernie Sanders movement in the United States, the Jeremy Corbyn movement in the United Kingdom, and other instances of rise of the left show, there is scope for a left-wing politics today. And the scope for left-wing politics is as a politics that mobilizes the working class, the popular classes that we have today, that were created by neoliberalism itself, mobilizes them through the use of a combination of social media and traditional forms of mobilization through trade unions, through political parties, through new community organizations and new forms of mobilization that we're starting to discover. This is extremely interesting, what is happening in the US and in the UK. Also in other countries, in Greece or in Brazil, countries that had left-wing governments.
You just had elections in Brazil because by your background you're Brazilian, and we know what kind of personality won there. Are you worried about that? What will be the perspective of such a pivotal country by its importance as Brazil is?
It's very negative. So in Brazil, you had a center-left administration that ended in absolute collapse. Similarly in Greece. So the left must be very careful with the kinds of politics that it implements, because its track record recently has been very negative. Lots of promise, but lack of capacity to implement. In the case of Brazil, you have a proper fascist new president that will take power on the 1st of January, with the added disadvantage of absolute inexperience in public administration. So with the capacity to create enormous chaos and confusion in the political system, and with the prospect of great political instability in the country. So I'm very pessimistic about what is going to happen in Brazil over the next year or two.
We are talking about Brazil, and then we have the United States of America. Is the emergence of Trump some kind of a signal of a tired empire, of the biggest great power which is actually losing its power? Can that be, how should I say, explained the rise of Trumpism through this kind of paradigm?
I think it can. I think the social base that voted for Trump was very heavily concentrated amongst part of the white working class in the United States that lost out heavily under neoliberalism, the traditional Rust Belt workers that went for Trump partly out of hope and partly out of hopelessness, but also the more privileged strata of US society with sometimes economic interests.
Middle class.
Exactly, that were favored by the tax reforms, that were favored by, take apart the rhetoric of Trump, the actual economic policies that were implemented by this administration, blatantly and completely favor those who have, as opposed to those who have not. So completely, again, betraying the voters that lent their support to that political program, but then clouding it over with a confusion of discourse and rhetoric, and shrill attacks on the media and on the political enemies of Trump. But there is limited mileage to this kind of politics. Once the US economy decelerates, which it is already decelerating, signaling that by the time when the next elections come and Trump will be going for his re-election, there will be very likely great confusion in terms of US economic performance, leading to the possibility of a political turnaround in the United States. Let us hope that this is what's going to happen.
What is the basis? Which are the issues? What are the offers for the left in order to mobilize bigger public support?
I think to build a left politics against neoliberalism, it is very important to rescue a collectivity, the sense of collectivity at the cultural level, at the sense of the shared material circumstances, that has been largely lost in the past. And a way to try and restore this in circumstances where production processes have been internationalized and disintegrated at the national level and integrated at international level, so disconnecting people from their neighborhoods, from their friends, creating permanent pools of unemployment. The alternative, in my point of view, is to go for public service provision, to things that belong to the citizenship, to the decommodification of public provision of basic goods and services. That, I think, around health, mobilizations around education, transport.
Bigger level of solidarity.
Solidarity, the construction of brotherhood, sisterhood between people that has been so battered recently.
This sounds very Marxist, and some would say, because we are coming from that kind of historical background, it's a kind of a socialist vision, if not a communist, a socialist vision of the society. Can it be actually successful, especially in the West?
It will be successful if people make it successful, if it attracts attention, if it brings people to examine the possibilities for their own future. A future that is today challenged not only by neoliberalism, not just by financial crisis, not just by political crisis, but by the environmental crisis as well. If we fail to confront these challenges, we are finished. As a civilization, we are finished. So it's absolutely central for young people especially, that have their whole lives in front of them, to look and to stare in the face of the limitations of neoliberalism and to confront the limitations of capitalism and think, what is it that we want as a society, as a planet to live in?
And yet, Brexit is going to come in a few months. We are going to the European elections next year, which everyone predicts that it is going to be a big gain for the rightists and for the far rights. So what are the, let's say, midterm perspectives of what you're actually suggesting that should happen?
The perspective is, as I mentioned before, the dominant tendency is negative. It is towards authoritarianism, it's towards a renewal of the financial crises of neoliberal capitalism. And this tendency will not materialize only if there is mobilization to the contrary. Only if there is this effort to bring people together, to discuss alternatives, to develop new options at the ground level and at national level, to try and develop and create and implement a new form of politics that is genuinely participatory.
Is democracy actually at this level willing to decentralize, as actually you are suggesting, and to actually push the power from the top to the bottom? Can it be done peacefully? Can it be done democratically?
We will have to find out. I believe it is. I believe participation is important and it is possible. In the UK, the experience recently has been very positive with this whole Corbyn movement around the Labour Party, but not contained only within the British Labour Party. So it shows that there are alternatives, and there's a lot of experience, good experience, coming from the United States as well and from other parts of the world. So we are in the process of discovering new forms of politics because we are in this moment of transition, because we can see that the politics of neoliberalism has failed, because we can see that the economics of neoliberalism has failed. So it is upon us to discuss, to think through, to develop new forms of politics, to fertilize ideas. It's not a matter of recovering something that happened politically 100 years ago, but it is a matter of discovering what are the fragilities, the fault lines of neoliberalism today, and how can we address them. This is the challenge that we have now.
Thank you very much for your kindness to give the interview for One TV.
Thank you, Sasha.